The Grenlec Debates, powering bright ideas.
You're watching the 11th season of the Grenlec Debates. Please bear in mind that matches, topics, and positions are randomly selected by schools. The theme for the quarterfinals is Litter and Our Environment. I am Rohan Bernard, your chairperson, and I call this house to order. And the motion is, be it resolved that legislation is the only way to tackle the litter problem. The proposition, the Anglican High. The opposition, Wesley College. Please welcome the first speaker for the proposition.
Good afternoon, all. We strongly affirm the mood, be it resolved, that legislation is the only way to tackle the litter problem. I will discuss the criticality of legislation and its effective enforcement as the sole means of effectively addressing littering. My colleague will present concrete evidence to prove same. Black's Law Dictionary defines legislation as the act and/or process of making or enacting laws. Only matchless dictionary.com. Tackle, to take hold of or grapple with intent of stopping or subduing. Merriam-Webster. Litter problem, an unwelcome or harmful situation which arises when any material, substance, or thing is deposited in any public or private property or waters without permission to do so. U.S. Legal Dictionary. Judges. The World Health Organization in 2016 explains that littering bears immense threats to the very survival of our ecology, our environment, our economies, and our humanity. They further contend that any response aimed at tackling this issue must commit persons and hold them accountable toward combating and preventing litter. Opponents. The only mechanism that can serve these dual functions is legislation. This is validated by the American Psychological Association, which notes that the law is the cultural force that has the important functions of imposing and controlling human patterns of behavior. And our opponents may point to public education, voluntarism, and anti-littering campaigns. However, we affirm that in order for any of these mechanisms to have any meaningful impact, they must be legislated. Judges. Today's discourse requires us to examine the relationship between law, morality, and culture. Indeed, curbing littering mandates moral and cultural reform. In brief, it requires significant changes in habits. The great Martin Luther King Jr. opines that while morality cannot be legislated, while law may not change the hearts of men, it does change the habits of men. King further explains that when habits change, attitudes and hearts change, hence the need for legislation to grapple with the littering problem. Judges. The cost associated with littering is exorbitant. The Environmental Protection Agency estimates that Ghana spent an alarming $3.45 million US. In Canada, the City News newspaper reports that $25 million per year is spent on littering. The Grenada Solid Waste Authority states that for 2017, $4,959,014 was spent on waste collection and street cleaning. And despite daily broadcasts on 7 radio stations, television adverts, schools outreach, littering continues to escalate. Opponents. The inherent shortcomings of these methods strongly validate the need for legislation. The Abatement of Litter Act No. 35 and Waste Management Act No. 16, Revised Laws of Grenada, both outline the offense of littering and the associated penalties. And while these laws are designed to serve as both a deterrent and a punitive measure, we contend that legislation without enforcement is no legislation at all. Attorney at Law, Mr. Ruggles Ferguson, concurs and states that strategic and consistent enforcement of these legislations will modify persons' cultural perception and ultimately effect positive behavioral change. And so, we call for 1, the implementation of comprehensive legislation to effectively manage all waste types by individuals and institutions, and 2, the necessary infrastructure to support enforcement of same. Judges. The United Nations asserts that for sustainable development to be realized in any nation, its economic, social, and environmental pillars must be strengthened. Littering adversely affects all 3, our tourism, our health, our green economy. And the fact that our current approaches have not brought us to a state where we can reasonably manage our waste threatens our ability to achieve sustainable economic development and our very survival. Opponents, can we afford to leave our country's key economic pillars in the hands of people's goodwill? We need a more proactive, comprehensive, and decisive approach where individuals and institutions are held accountable if we are to mitigate and alleviate littering. And the only mechanism that is capable of achieving this is legislation.
The first speaker for the opposition.
Good afternoon to all. My colleagues and I unwaveringly oppose the motion that legislation is the only way to tackle the litter problem. As first speaker, I will redefine key terms in the mood, point out the shortcomings of depending only on legislation to combat crimes, and expound on the importance of education as a critical factor in dealing with this issue. Our second speaker will provide evidence to show that there are other effective ways to tackle the litter problem, while our third and fourth speakers will clarify the fallacies brought forth by the proposition. Legislation, a law or set of laws suggested by a government and made official by a parliament. Dictionary.cambridge.org. This same source defines only as a term is to show that there is a single one or that there are no others. Tackle, to deal with in an efficient way. collegedictionary.com. Litter refers to rubbish such as paper, cans, and bottles left lying in an open or public place. oxforddictionaries.com. Therefore, the moot is saying that there is no other way to deal efficiently with the problem of leaving rubbish in open or public places other than having a set of laws made official by the parliament, and we on this side undauntedly oppose this. Audience, legaldesire.com in an article entitled The Importance of Law in Society, dated 20th September 2017, postulates that laws are important as it serves as a norm of conduct or guideline as to what is accepted in society. Therefore, we are in no way suggesting that we should not have laws to tackle the litter problem. However, we contend that legislation is not the only way to tackle this issue, since, as reviewed in an article from withhost.com dated February 21st, 2018, and I quote, "Laws do not prevent crime, they punish it," end of quote. This article asserts that with all the legislations, there are still crimes being committed. Judges, right here in Grenada, you may recall the gruesome and brutal death of 9-year-old Aria Bola. This created shockwaves which reverberated throughout the diaspora, with a call for strengthening the laws against child sexual abuse. Since her death in November 2017 to September 2018, according to Grenada Child Protection Authority, there have been 148 reported cases of child sexual abuse. It means, therefore, that despite the maximum 30-year sentence for child sexual abuse, this scourge in society continues. So you see, legislation definitely cannot be the only way to control or deter persons from committing crimes. Audience, the punishment for child sexual abuse is incomparable to that of littering. Yet still, notwithstanding the severity of the punishment, it continues unabated. Want to stop a driver from throwing trash outside his window if he knows no one will see? Audience, you may also recall a few years ago, a man from St. Andrews surrendered himself to the Grenlec police station, carrying 2 human heads in a bucket. I say no more. Judges, let us not underestimate the importance of education in tackling the litter problem. According to the beliefs, attitudes, and values theory put forward by Milton Woolridge, a social psychologist, values are the most important variable because by affecting a person's values, true persuasion occurs as these are beliefs that a person aims to live by. How can we affect a person's values? Through all forms of education. Through formal education, the developers of the affected domain of behavioral and instructional objectives, Quathor et al. 1964, advance the development of positive attitudes, values, and emotions is critical to the expected changes in behavior, wherein students are taught the importance of positive attitudes and values. It is internalized and eventually characterized, becoming a part of their everyday behavior. Opponents, if students understand the importance of a litter-free, healthy environment, then they will be less inclined to litter. Additionally, through public sensitization, the attitudes and the values of the wider public will be positively affected and in turn lessen the likelihood of them littering. Judges, according to the great Nelson Mandela, education is the most powerful weapon which it can use to change the world. As such, legislation can never be the only way to tackle the litter problem. Thank you.
The second speaker for the proposition.
Good afternoon, all. I wish to challenge our opponent's definition and further reinforce our own. Judges, perhaps the most telling example that highlighted the need for legislation and the enforcement thereof was a tragic occurrence that occurred in West St. David, September 2018. At 2 a.m. in the morning, a home was immediately engulfed in fire, and trapped in it was an 8-year-old and her mom. Judges, what followed was heartbreaking. According to the Fire Department Service of the RGPF, 2 abandoned vehicles along the road, a popular type of littering, hindered emergency fire services from gaining access to the routes to provide help in a timely manner. Judges, sadly, this little girl passed away a few days later. Opponents, these vehicles have been positioned there for many weeks before this tragic occurrence. Do you honestly think that individuals would have so discarded these vehicles? If legislation were relative to littering was being actively enforced, if persons were being made to pay penalties for their action? And so, opponents, do you still think that we should still leave it up to persons' own volition, up to public education to tackle the litter problem? The problem of littering has transcended far beyond the borders of public education, far beyond self-consciousness, far beyond volunteerism. It is time for action. It is time for effective enforcement of legislation. Esteemed judges, we maintain that legislation is the only vehicle through which meaningful social changes can be brought about. In fact, the importance of legislation as a one sure medium for tackling litter is validated worldwide. Let us examine Singapore, a model country recognized by the United Nations for its cleanliness. According to the National Environment Agency, despite multiple attempts such as public awareness drives, placement of extra bins, etc., it was only through the introduction and subsequent enforcement of Part 3 of the Environmental Public Health Act, which makes it an offense to litter, that a decline in same was realized. They explained that the penalties with respect to fines and even jail terms forcibly compelled persons to conform to anti-littering rules. Dr. William Wan, former head of Singapore's civil service, asserts that legislation has been the only way to realize changes in habits. Judges, so effective was legislation as a reason for significant improvement in Singapore's littering situation that their success story was adapted by Great Britain, according to the Independent magazine. In April 2018, Britain's Environment Minister Therese Coffey announced that persons as well as businesses who litter would be faced with Singapore-style on-the-spot fines of up to £150 as part of government plans to clamp down on the scourges of rubbish dumped on Britain's streets. This decision, esteemed judges, is supported by residents themselves. According to the Independent magazine, persons explained that following careful analysis of other methods to effect change, legislation is the only way in which a strong message can be sent to those who think that their laziness is more important than the environment in which they live. Worthy opponents, if international organizations and ordinary individuals themselves regard legislation as the only guaranteed way to tackle littering problem, who are you or me to contend otherwise? Judges, legislation by its very nature is the only way to tackle the littering problem.
The second speaker for the opposition.
Good afternoon to all. I stand by the definitions we have presented. Do not allow yourselves to be misled by the proposition into thinking that legislation is the only way to tackle the litter problem. Allow me to look at what countries have been doing to tackle this problem to show you that there are other efficient ways of dealing with this issue. Let us take a look at Sweden. According to an article retrieved from improv.com dated April 4, 2018, Sweden is one of the most beautiful places on earth with garbage-free streets and sanitary facilities everywhere, ranked third cleanest in the world. The author explained that Swedish people are quite keen on being out in nature and are aware of what needs to be done to maintain a clean environment. The Swedish Director of Waste Management Association affirmed in an article entitled, "Sweden's recycling is so revolutionary, the country has run out of rubbish," dated 8 December 2016, and I quote, "We worked on communication for a long time to make people aware not to throw things outdoor so we can recycle and reuse," end of quote. This same article advanced that Sweden is so good at recycling that for several years it has imported rubbish from other countries to keep its recycling plants going. So you see, through education of the population and development of recycling facilities, Sweden was able to tackle the litter problem. How then can a proponent suggest that this could only be done through legislation? Another case in point, in an article retrieved from cleanseas.org dated 12 October 2018, Guatemala is actively fighting plastic pollution through innovation and community participation, and advanced that the country is stopping plastic from entering oceans using innovative tools such as biofences that are installed in rivers. The author asserts, and I quote, "Biofences are a response to pollution, but you want to attack the problem at its root, drastically reducing the individual consumption of plastic through education." End of quote. Judges, again we see other countries are merging innovative ways with education to tackle the litter problem. Coming closer to home, according to a 2014 article, Anti-Litter Campaign initiated in Roseau, cited on DominicanNewsOnline.com, and I quote, "A number of stakeholders have joined forces in a campaign geared at solving issues relating to littering in the city of Roseau." End of quote. This article highlighted the many different ways the city tackled litter problem during this campaign, including erecting waste advisory billboards around Roseau, advertising garbage collection schedule on TV and radio, as well as making media appearances to educate the public on the campaign. Erecting waste advisory billboards, advertising garbage collection schedule, Dominica has offered 2 other ways to tackle the litter problem. More food for our opponents. So we must stand firm. Legislation can never be the only way. Judges, we must reiterate that we are not against legislation as a way of tackling the litter problem. However, we contend by way of our submission, it cannot and will never be the only way. Thank you.
The opposition cross-examiner.
Worthy opponents, we have presented empirical data in the form of a theory put forward by a social psychologist to show that through education you affect persons' values and attitudes, thus causing a change in behavior. Where is your empirical data to show that legislation is the only way to tackle the litter problem?
My opponents, if you did your research, you would see that in Singapore, legislation had worked effectively, and Great Britain saw that it worked so well that they took the initiative to start doing what Singapore is doing, and Sweden as well.
For the opponents, and yes, we accept that, but you would have heard that my first and second speaker stated that Dominica, Guatemala, and Sweden would have used other efficient ways in tackling the litter problem.
My opponents, let me finish. My opponent, but the littering problem still exists in these countries, and officials in Sweden credited legislation, not other alternatives.
Well, the opponent legislation was coupled with other things, as my first speaker stated. Moving on with the opponent. Well, the opponent, our second speaker highlighted that Sweden was able to deal effectively with littering through recycling and communication. Are these not alternative ways to tackle the litter problem?
My opponent, doesn't the littering problem still exist?
You are not answering my question, what the opponent. Are these not alternative ways to tackle the litter problem?
Yes, they are, but they are not effective according to the definition.
Yes, you are proposing
my opponent,
that yes, you are proposing that legislation is the only way to tackle the litter problem.
May I have a chance to finish?
What the opponent,
according to, can I answer the question now? According to the definition,
you already answered my question.
No, you didn't give me a chance. This is not an argument, it's a debate. It is not an argument,
I asked you
it's a debate.
If these are not alternative ways to tackle the litter problem, and you said
question.
yes. So we are moving on. What the opponents? According to the Grenada Green Group in an article retrieved from nowgrenada.com, we have a litter law that came into place in August 2015. However, this law is not being enforced. Is this how you tackle the litter problem, by legislation with a law sitting on the shelf for the opponent?
If you were listening to my first speaker's speech, legislation is not effective unless it is enforced. That's why we call for a strategic plan to enforce the law.
What are the opponents, and how can the legislation be enforced if the people don't know about it? Thus, you have to educate the people, what the opponents, about the law, and also about the effect that littering has on the community, what the opponents. And this will cause them to have a change in behavior, what the opponents.
The process of implementing the legislation deals with consultation, so therefore the public will be aware of the legislation.
The opponent, the public will not be aware unless you educate them. What the opponent, whether it is informal or formally.
How would they know about the law if they are not educating on it?
Exactly, my word. Right, so therefore
the process of implementing legislation would have consultation.
The proposition cross-examiner.
Opponent, please provide empirical evidence to show that alternative methods that you have suggested have tackled the littering problem in Grenada.
Well, the opponent, the moot was not specific to Grenada.
My
And as
opponent-
I stated,
I know that.
allow
I
me
know
to answer
that.
the question with the opponent.
Let me just finish
With
my
the opponent,
statement.
our empirical data
My
is in the
opponent,
form of
can
a
I
theory.
finish my statement before you answer? I know that the mood doesn't specify to Grenada, but I will ask you other questions on other countries. So can you answer the question now?
And I was doing so with the opponent.
But
no,
I'm just giving
I
you
was
clarification.
saying, as I was saying with the opponent, we have presented our empirical data in the form of a theory put forward by Milton Rokish, a social psychologist, stating that through education you affect people's morals and values
My
and will thus
opponent-
cause them to have a change in behavior with the opponent.
According-
And so we are proposing
According-
that if you educate the people on the
My
effects of
according to
littering
the
on the environment with the
definition-
opponent, you will cause them to think
According
twice
to the
about littering
definition
with the
of
opponent.
tackle, which means to take hold of with the intent of stopping or subduing, education, all the
What
other
the opponents and our
method-
definition
methods,
of tackle is to deal with something efficiently.
and our definition says to stop or subdue. Next question. Opponent, what have been the returns on the investments made in regard to current strategies to combat littering?
Excuse me, what the opponent, can you repeat?
I'm basically asking you, all the investments that were made, money, time, energy, what were the returns made
Returns made for what were the opponents?
for the investments in regard to current strategies to combat littering?
Current strategies, like what were the opponents?
Current strategies?
Like what?
To combat that, what you suggested?
What the opponent, these strategies are not current for the opponents.
Really?
Yeah.
So then you're just contradicting your own argument?
No, what the opponents,
Next
we are
question.
proposing something with the opponents.
Next question. Opponent, the United Nations Environmental Programme states that the other methods have not gone far enough to halt the expansion of litter, but legislation is a more formidable force. Surely this nullifies your team's entire argument?
What the opponents, and how does it notify our arguments with the opponents?
Because the United Nations Environmental Programme states that other methods have not gone far enough to halt the expansion
But what the opponent, my
of
first and
litter,
second
but
speaker would have
legislation
stated-
is a more formidable force.
But what the opponent, my
Formidable.
first and second speaker stated that other countries use other alternatives
But
and
the
they
litter
work
problem
with the
still
opponent.
exists.
What the opponent, and you think, what the
littering problem
opponent,
still
you think that
exists.
if you put a law against
opponent?
littering, people would care?
You-
If they
my
don't care
opponent-
about what the opponent,
so
they
are
are
you
bigger.
insinuating
What the
that we are
opponents-
lawless people?
What the opponents,
Is that
I'm
what you're
saying that laws do
insinuating?
not prevent crime. They only punish it with me,
We
which
cannot
means
just
what the
rely
opponent,
on people's moral
what the opponent,
volition.
no, I'm not
Next
saying
question.
that. What the
Next
opponent,
question.
laws
Let
do
us
not
move on.
prevent
Time is
crime.
of
They
the
only
essence.
punish it for the opponents.
Yeah.
The opposition rebuttal speaker.
Good afternoon. It is very disheartening to listen to the proponents' misleading arguments. Allow me to clarify. Your first speaker said that legislation is the only effective way to deal with the litter problem, but the mood did not speak to the effectiveness of the way. However, as our second speaker highlighted, Sweden, Guatemala, and even Dominica were able to tackle the litter problem effectively in other ways rather than by legislation. In addition, how can you be sure that legislation will tackle this issue when people break the laws regardless of the consequences? Your second speaker said that legislation is the only act proactive enough to stop littering. But as our first speaker says, laws do not prevent the crime, they punish it. Your first speaker said that law changes habits of persons who commit crimes and they face punishment. Still, we see more crimes being committed every day. How do laws change habits? Education is what changes people's habits, morals, and values. Legislation only works when enforced, but what are your opponents? Laws cannot be enforced without first properly educating the people about the law. It is obvious that the proponents are grabbing at straws. They have not provided any empirical evidence to prove that legislation is the only way to tackle the litter problem. In fact, the evidence brought forth by my team and I indicates otherwise. We need to change people's value system and, by extension, their behavior through education. We have highlighted the different ways countries have tackled this issue together with legislation. Don't be misled. Legislation is not and will never be the only way to tackle the litter problem. Thank you.
The proposition rebuttal speaker.
Good afternoon, all. Our opponents have made some erroneous statements which cannot be left to stand. Our opponents mentioned public awareness. However, this is deficient. It makes you aware, but it does not guarantee action. They also mentioned public education as an alternative, but opponents, we recognize the importance of education. However, while education makes you knowledgeable about littering, it doesn't compel you to act. And according to the WHO, in order to tackle littering problem, there must be a mechanism that has this forcible characteristic. Our opponents talked about several countries where legislations are being implemented, yet the problem still exists. Opponents, you can do a comparative analysis of the said problem. It is quite probable that the problem was worse prior. Your first speaker spoke about the laws do not prevent crimes, they punish it. But they fail to realize that when habits change, attitudes and hearts change. Our opponents, you call for an inclusive approach, but isn't this what we have right now? We have legislation, public education, we still have the litter problem. That is why we maintain the effective enforcement of legislation as the only way to tackle the litter problem. Judges, the plain and simple truth is that legislation, by its compelling and accountable nature, far supersedes all other methods. It is the only way to tackle the litter problem. I thank you.
And the winner is the Anglican High. Thank you for joining us. Please tune in for the rest of Season 11 of the Grenlec Debates. Visit us on Facebook to vote for your favorite debater.
The Grenlec Debates. Powering bright ideas. Vote for your favorite debater on our Facebook page. The Grenlec Debates. Powering bright ideas.